The year was 1962. Harlem pulsed with a rhythm all its own, a heartbeat that came from the street corner, the barber shops, the after-hours clubs, and the dreams of a people determined to survive in a city that had never quite made room for them. The diner was called Morrison's. It sat on 125th Street like a chrome-plated sentinel, its red leather booths worn smooth by decades of conversations, deals, confessions, and dreams. The jukebox in the corner played jazz, real jazz, not the watered-down stuff they played downtown. The smell of bacon grease, fresh coffee, and possibility hung in the air like incense in a church. The tiles on the floor were black and white in a checkerboard pattern, creating an optical illusion that made the space feel larger than it was. The counter ran the entire length of the west wall, with 15 spinning stools topped in that same red leather. Above the counter hung a menu board with white plastic letters, items crossed out and replaced so many times that the board itself looked like it had lived 1,000 different lives. The walls were decorated with photographs: Billie Holiday, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, Joe Louis. These were the photographs of heroes, the saints of Black America, pinned up like prayers in a sanctuary. Morrison had owned this place for 23 years, and he'd watched Harlem transform around him. He'd watched Prohibition come and go, he'd watched the war, he'd watched his own son leave for Korea and never come back. The diner was more than just a place to eat. It was a temple, a courthouse, a confessional. In these booths, men had planned businesses, ended marriages, made peace with old enemies, and decided their fates. The food was good, but that wasn't why people came. They came because Morrison's was neutral territory in a city that had few neutral territories left. It was 6:47 in the evening on a Tuesday. The dinner rush had started, but this time of day occupied a strange space between lunch and evening. The working people had mostly left, and the night people hadn't quite arrived yet. The diner was perhaps half full. Enough patrons that it felt alive, but not so many that you couldn't hear a conversation at the next table if you really wanted to. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, sat in the third booth from the front, on the left side. The booth that had a perfect sightline to the entrance, the booth where a man could see who was coming and going. He wasn't a tall man, 5'7", maybe 5'8" on a generous day, but the way he carried himself made height irrelevant. His suit was custom-tailored gray wool with a subtle pinstripe that caught the light when he moved. His tie was silk, deep burgundy with a single pearl pin that had belonged to his father. His shoes were Italian leather, buffed to a mirror shine. The leather so soft it moved like water when he walked. He was 58 years old, but his face looked older, much older. Prison had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time passing. It was the kind of aging that came from being caged, from being reduced to a number, from having your humanity questioned every single day for 18 years. But his eyes were ageless, dark and sharp, and missing absolutely nothing. They took in the diner the way a general surveyed a battlefield, assessing, calculating, understanding the terrain. Bumpy had learned to read rooms the way other men read books. He could sense mood shifts, he could detect lies, he could feel intention in the air like an animal sensing weather. Bumpy had spent 18 years in prison, 18 years for drug trafficking. He'd been released 2 years ago and had spent that time building something in the spaces between law and necessity. An organization. A community, a way of life that existed in the shadows, providing for the neighborhoods that the city's white power structure had abandoned. The coffee in front of him was untouched. It came from his own thermos, brought from home that morning. Bumpy never drank from public cups if he could help it. Too many ways for things to go wrong. Too many opportunities for the world to poison you, literally or figuratively. He was eating a piece of sweet potato pie made fresh that morning by Morrison's wife, not the frozen garbage that most places served. The pie was good, the coffee he'd brought was better. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, taking his time. Bumpy had learned in prison that the only thing a man truly owned was the time it took him to do something. Food, women, money, all of those could be taken away. But time, if you refused to rush it, was yours alone. He was alone at the booth, which in itself was unusual. Usually, Bumpy had people around him, associates, lieutenants, young men building their fortunes in the underworld, men who worked for him or with him, or in some complicated way both. But not today. Today, he'd come to Morrison's by himself. He'd wanted to be alone with his thoughts, his pie, and his coffee. He didn't know what was about to happen. Or perhaps, in some deep way that he didn't admit to himself, he did know. Bumpy had survived as long as he had because he could sense consequences approaching. The way an animal senses predators, the 5 detectives entered together, but they tried to make it look casual, like 5 separate men who happened to arrive at the same moment, like they weren't coordinated, like they weren't hunters closing in on their prey. They failed completely. The diner had the peculiar talent of detecting law enforcement the way a dog detects fear. It was something about the way police moved, something about the way they carried authority in their bodies, like it was a weapon they were always ready to deploy. Something about the way they looked at the people around them, not as human beings, but as subjects, as variables in an equation they were trying to solve. The cook in the back, Maria, she sensed it first. She stopped moving, just for a second. The knife she was using froze mid-chop. Her hands went still. She'd been serving this community for 30 years. She could read its rhythms. The waitress, a woman named Constance, who'd been working at Morrison's for 16 years, she felt it next. She was about to bring a burger to a customer when she paused. Her body registered the shift. The air in the diner had changed. Even the couple in the booth nearest the window felt the temperature shift. They were young, maybe just married, out for a date. They looked at each other and something unsaid passed between them. They knew. Everyone knew. The lead detective was Detective Harrison. He was tall, 6'2", with the kind of face that had been weathered by sun and bad decisions made in service of the law. His nose had been broken at some point and never properly set. His jaw was square and his eyes were gray, the color of concrete. His suit was brown, serviceable. The kind of suit a man wore when he cared about looking professional but not about looking impressive. He moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, of someone who'd spent his entire adult life being obeyed. His shoes were polished to military precision. His partner was Detective Mosley, shorter by 4 inches, wider through the shoulders. Mosley had the perpetual expression of a man who'd seen everything twice and wasn't impressed the 3rd time around. His face was scarred, a knife fight in his younger days, though nobody asked about it anymore. He had the build of a man who'd been a boxer, and in fact he had been back at an amateur circuit, back in his 20s. He'd given it up for the badge. Behind them came 3 more detectives, whose names would become less important as the minutes unfolded. Detective Price, Detective Walsh, and Detective Carmichael. They were younger than Harrison and Mosley. Early 30s, ambitious, hungry. The kind of men who wanted to make their mark on the world, even if that mark came in black ink on arrest warrants. What mattered wasn't their individual names or their individual characteristics. What mattered was their collective purpose. They were there for Bumpy Johnson. They were there to remind him that he was being watched, that he was known, that, despite the 2 years since his release, despite the careful way he'd been building his organization, he remained a marked man. They knew who he was. Harlem's criminal kingpin. Harlem's Robin Hood, depending on who you ask. The man who'd filled a power vacuum when Lucky Luciano had been imprisoned. The man who'd kept the Italian mob out of Harlem, at least as much as any one man could keep anyone out of anything. They'd been building a case for 6 months. Nothing concrete enough to charge him yet. But they had leads, witnesses, paper trails, informants who were finally willing to talk. At least, they were willing enough that the detectives thought they could pressure them further. This wasn't an arrest. Not yet. This was something more delicate. This was an interrogation, an interview. A conversation designed to unsettle, to remind, to establish dominance. It was a power play dressed up as police work. Detective Harrison made eye contact with Bumpy across the diner. Just for a moment. Long enough to communicate intention. Long enough to say without words, "I see you. I know you. I'm coming for you." Then he began walking toward the booth. His 4 colleagues spread out, positioning themselves around the diner. 1 by the counter, 2 near the door, 1 by the kitchen entrance. They were creating a perimeter. They were sealing off escape routes that didn't exist. The diner fell silent. Not gradually. All at once, like someone had pressed a mute button on the world. The jukebox was still playing Billie Holiday, singing something about strange fruit, but it seemed quiet now. The sound of silverware against plates continued, but it sounded distant, like it was coming from another room, another time, another world. People who'd been talking stopped mid-sentence. The couple on a date stopped looking at each other. Morrison, who was in the back with Maria, stepped out to watch. Constance froze with her serving tray. Bumpy Johnson continued eating his pie. He didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge the detectives. He simply continued eating with the deliberate slowness of a man who'd learned that any rush is a form of panic. Ellsworth Johnson, Harrison said, arriving at the booth. He placed his hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. It was a gesture designed to intimidate, a gesture that said, "I'm in control here." Bumpy set down his fork with careful precision. The sound of it hitting the plate seemed impossibly loud in the silent diner. "Detective Harrison," Bumpy said, looking up for the first time. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I know who you are. I've seen you around. Sit down." It wasn't a request. And, despite the absolute absence of threat in his voice, despite the fact that Bumpy had simply invited them to sit, every person in the diner understood that something fundamental had shifted. A man who'd just been approached by 5 police officers had not reacted with fear. He had not stood up. He had not become defensive. Instead, he'd invited them to sit, and in that invitation, there was an assertion of power that no badge could match. Harrison hesitated. That hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was visible. Mosley shifted his weight. The 3 younger detectives exchanged glances. Finally, Harrison slid into the booth across from Bumpy. Mosley slid in next to him, trapping Harrison slightly, establishing that this was an interrogation, not a conversation. The 3 other detectives found positions nearby, 1 against the counter, looking down at Bumpy like a watchtower. 2 standing by the door, blocking any exit. They were boxing him in, except they weren't. He'd invited them in. He'd established the terms. He'd decided that this conversation would happen in his space, at his table, according to his rules. "I suppose you're here about something," Bumpy said, going back to his pie. He cut a small piece and put it in his mouth, chewing slowly. "We need to ask you some questions," Harrison began. His voice had shifted. It was official now, the voice of law and authority. The voice of a man who'd been trained to project power. "About your business activities, about your associates, about how you're making your living, about the distribution network we've been tracking." He laid out the charges like a prosecutor laying out a case, but he was careful not to actually charge Bumpy with anything. That came later, if at all. Bumpy set down his fork again. This time, he looked at both detectives directly. His eyes moved from Harrison to Mosley and back again. The eyes of a man who was assessing, calculating, understanding his position. "Is there something specific you'd like to know?" he asked. His voice was still calm, still conversational. He sounded like a man talking to an old friend about nothing in particular. "We know you're operating a drug operation in Harlem," Harrison said, his voice rising slightly. It was an escalation, a pressure tactic. It was meant to provoke, to pressure, to crack whatever persona Bumpy had carefully constructed. "We know you've got people on every corner selling heroin. We know you're profiting from the addictions of this community. We know about the supply lines. We know about the money laundering." He was listing accusations like a man reading a grocery list, each one designed to land like a punch. "We've got witnesses," Mosley added, his voice rougher than Harrison's. "People willing to testify. We've got documentation. We've got enough to bring you in right now if we want to." It was an interrogation delivered like a hammer blow. It was meant to suggest that the walls were closing in, that cooperation was the only smart play, that Bumpy's time had run out. Bumpy listened without interruption. He finished the bite of pie he was chewing. He took a sip from his own coffee. He seemed to be considering the accusation the way a man considers the weather, as a fact of existence, neither good nor bad, just something that is. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and measured. "You're right," he said simply. "I am." The room froze. Even the jukebox seemed to pause mid-song. Mosley leaned forward aggressively. "You're going to confess just like that? Without a lawyer?" "Confess," Bumpy smiled. But there was no humor in it. There was something else in that smile, something knowing, something almost sad. "No, detective, I'm not confessing to anything. I'm acknowledging a truth you already know. Yes, there are drugs in Harlem. Yes, people are addicted. Yes, someone is making money from that addiction." He paused, setting down his napkin with the same careful precision he'd used with his fork. "What I'm asking you is simple. Do you know who really built this empire? Do you know how it actually works? Do you know what it took to create the conditions that make what I'm doing not just possible, but inevitable?" Harrison's jaw tightened. This wasn't going the way interrogations were supposed to go. Bumpy was supposed to be defensive. He was supposed to be calculating his legal position. He was supposed to be scared. Instead, he was asking questions. "Why don't you tell us?" Harrison said, and there was an edge to his voice now. An edge that suggested he was losing control of the situation. Bumpy leaned back in the booth. The leather creaked under his weight. He looked at the 5 detectives, really looked at the man, seemed to be making a decision about something, about what truth to tell, about how much to reveal. When I was a boy, Bumpy began, his voice dropping slightly so that people in the diner had to lean in to hear him. My mother died. I was around 9 years old. We didn't have much. The city didn't help us. The police certainly didn't help us. He paused. A few people in the diner had stopped pretending not to listen. They were openly watching now. She got sick. Pneumonia, the doctor said. But we didn't have money for medicine. The clinic turned us away because we couldn't pay. The government had no programs for people like us. The police weren't interested in helping a black family struggling to survive. So she got worse and worse. And I watched my mother die because your system didn't think she was worth saving. Bumpy's voice didn't change. It remained calm, conversational, almost detached, but there was something underneath it. A memory of pain, a memory of helplessness. Do you know what I learned that day? Detective Harrison didn't respond. I learned that the system doesn't care about people like me, that the government, the law, the whole apparatus, it doesn't exist to help us. It exists to control us, to keep us down, to remind us every single day that we're less than human. The diner was completely silent now. Even Morrison had come out of the back. He was standing near the kitchen, listening. So, yes, Bumpy continued, there's a drug operation in Harlem. And yes, I'm involved. But here's what you need to understand, and I want everyone in this diner to understand it too. He paused, letting his eyes move around the room, making sure he had the attention of everyone present. The drugs would be here whether I was here or not. Do you understand that? If I disappeared tomorrow, if you arrested me right now and threw away the key, the drugs would still be here. The Italian mob would have moved in. The Chinese gangs would have moved in. The Polish syndicates would have moved in. Someone was always going to exploit this community. Someone was always going to see a neighborhood of desperate people and think, opportunity? He leaned forward now, his elbows on the table. But here's the difference. Detective Harrison, here's what separates what I'm doing from what would have happened otherwise. When the Italians run the drug trade, the money goes to Manhattan. It goes to mob bosses sitting in fancy restaurants, planning their estates in the Hamptons. It goes to families that look nothing like anyone in this room. It goes out of Harlem and never comes back. Bumpy's voice was taking on a different quality now. It was still controlled, still measured, but there was passion underneath it. Not the passion of anger, but the passion of conviction. But when I do it, the money stays here. It stays in Harlem. Some of it goes into the pockets of my people, yes, but some of it, a lot of it, goes back into this community. We fund schools that the city won't fund. We help people pay their rent when they're about to be evicted. We provide medical care that the clinics won't provide. We do the work that government is supposed to do but doesn't. He pointed his finger, not aggressively, but with purpose. I'm not a philanthropist, I'm not a saint, I know exactly what I am. But the question you need to ask yourself is, what are you doing to help this community? What are you doing except enforcing laws that were written by people who don't live here, who don't care what happens here, who designed those laws specifically to keep people like me in prison? Mosley stood up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound shocking in the silence. His face was reddening. His jaw was clenched. His hand moved toward his service weapon instinctively, then stopped. He seemed to catch himself, to remember where he was, to remember that shooting an unarmed man in a crowded diner was not something he could explain away. You're not a hero, Johnson, Mosley said, his voice tight with anger. You're a criminal. You're poisoning this community. You're destroying families. I know exactly what I am, Bumpy said, looking directly at Mosley. The question is, Detective, do you know what you are? Mosley's face went even redder. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually hit Bumpy. But then, something stopped him. Maybe it was the knowledge that every person in the diner was watching. Maybe it was the awareness that violence right now would undermine everything they'd come here to do. I'm a police officer, Mosley said through gritted teeth. You're a man choosing to serve a system that abandoned the people you're supposed to protect, Bumpy said, his voice never rising, never showing anger. You're a man enforcing laws that were designed to keep my people in poverty. You're a man who can walk down any street in this city and be treated with respect because of that badge. I can't. I wear the finest suit in this diner, and I'm still a nigger to you. I'll always be a nigger to you. The word hung in the air like a curse, like a bell being rung. Some of the people in the diner flinched. The word had that power, it had that history. But Bumpy continued, his voice never rising, never showing anger. He was speaking like a man reciting facts, not like a man making accusations. Not because of anything I've done, not because of any choice I've made, but because of the color of my skin, because of where I was born. Because the system that you serve decided a long time ago that people like me are worth less than people like you. And you've spent your entire career enforcing that decision. He paused. So yes, I sell drugs. And yes, it's a crime. And yes, you could arrest me right now if you wanted to. You could put me in a cell and throw away the key and feel good about yourselves for getting a bad man off the streets. Bumpy's eyes moved to each detective in turn. But before you do, I want you to understand something. The real crime isn't what I'm doing. The real crime is what this city did to create the conditions where what I'm doing makes sense. The real crime is a system that says to a young black boy, your mother doesn't matter enough to save. Your neighborhood isn't important enough to protect. Your dreams aren't valuable enough to fund. And then, when that boy grows up and finds a way to survive outside the system, you arrest him for it. Harrison had been silent through all of this. He was a man used to being in control of conversations, and clearly this one had slipped away from him. His face was harder to read than Mosley's, but there was something in his eyes, a doubt, perhaps. A recognition of something. You want to arrest me? Bumpy asked. Go ahead. But first, answer me this one question, Detective. How many white drug dealers are in this precinct right now? How many white men in fancy suits are making money from heroin addiction? How many of them are sitting in police interrogations instead of in prison cells? A heavy silence settled over the diner as Bumpy Johnson continued speaking, exposing what he claimed was the true purpose of policing, not stopping drugs, but maintaining control, deciding who was allowed to profit, and enforcing racial and social hierarchy. Then, with unsettling calm, he shifted tone completely, praising the pie and offering it to the detectives as his treat. The gesture was disarming and surreal, blending hospitality with accusation and leaving the officers momentarily unsteady. When Harrison attempted to assert authority, his voice lacked conviction. Bumpy agreed to go peacefully, but insisted that everyone in the diner hear his words first. He declared that he was not the real criminal, the system was. He described himself as a symptom of poverty, neglect, and desperation, arguing that arresting him would change nothing. Others would simply take his place until the system itself was fixed. With quiet dignity, Bumpy prepared to leave, predicting that he would soon be released and that nothing in Harlem would change. He paid for his meal, tipped generously, and walked out, followed by the detectives. On the street, the community watched as he was escorted like a dignitary rather than a defeated man, and the story spread instantly. At the precinct, Bumpy endured a long interrogation in a harsh, windowless room, but said nothing. With his lawyer present, he refused to engage, and the detectives were left with no evidence that could justify charges. By midnight, they were forced to release him. Harrison drove Bumpy back to Harlem himself. During the ride, Bumpy told him that he believed Harrison was a good man trapped inside a bad system, someone who had wanted to help but instead became part of an order designed to control rather than protect. Harrison defended his role as maintaining order, but Bumpy named the tragedy plainly. Trying to uphold a corrupt system makes even good men complicit. That, he said, was the truth he wanted Harrison to understand. After Bumpy Johnson left the diner, Detective Harrison sat alone in the precinct, replaying the encounter in his mind. In all his years of interrogations, he had never witnessed anything like it. Bumpy had seized control without force, shrinking 5 detectives through calm, truth, and quiet dignity. Even the offer of pie had felt like an act of defiance, and Bumpy's exit left the officers diminished and unsettled. Harrison wrote down Bumpy's words in a notebook, not for any report, but because he knew they mattered. The sentence haunted him, forcing him to question everything he believed about law, order, and justice. For the first time, he wondered whether the system he served created the very crimes it punished. Those thoughts were dangerous for a man in uniform, threatening his career and the foundations of his identity. Yet Harrison could not push them away. Something fundamental had shifted in Morrison's diner, and he knew he would never see his work or himself the same way again. 3 weeks after the encounter at Morrison's diner, Detective Harrison was summoned to Captain Dunlap's office, a veteran of the force. Dunlap listened carefully as Harrison explained how Bumpy Johnson had openly admitted to selling drugs. exposed the hypocrisy of law enforcement, and walked free not through force, but through truth. Harrison admitted that while Johnson was clearly running the operation, there was no case that could hold. The community now saw Bumpy as a protector and the police as the villains. Dunlap slowly realized what had happened. What was meant to be an interrogation had become a public testimony. Johnson had used police authority to indict the system itself. Confronted with the truth of his own career, Dunlap questioned whether law enforcement was protecting justice or enforcing a criminal system. Exhausted and disillusioned, he ordered Harrison to drop the case, not out of fear, but out of moral fatigue. He could no longer pretend that law and order were the same thing. The story of that night spread rapidly through Harlem and beyond, growing into legend. Bumpy Johnson was no longer seen only as a drug dealer, but as a voice who articulated what many felt but feared to say. His words were quoted everywhere, and his reputation transformed into that of a symbol, someone who had seized narrative power itself. When police later tried to arrest him again, community leaders, churches, and even city officials pushed back. The case collapsed. In 1963, civil rights organizers approached Bumpy for funding, and he agreed without conditions. His money helped build movements, reinforcing the idea that power could be wielded through resources and intention, not just authority. Despite declining health, Bumpy continued both his criminal operations and his support of the community, becoming a living symbol of resistance and survival. In 1965, Bumpy Johnson died suddenly of a heart attack at 60. His funeral drew thousands from every walk of life, all honoring a man who had embodied the possibility of standing up to a system stacked against them. Detective Harrison attended quietly. He heard the many versions of the diner story, all sharing the same truth. A moment when power shifted from badges to words. Later, speaking with Morrison, the diner owner, Harrison admitted his regret not for failing to arrest Bumpy, but for failing to understand him sooner. Days later, Harrison returned alone to Morrison's diner and sat in the same booth, ordering the same sweet potato pie. He finally understood its meaning. The pie had not been an act of peace, but of certainty, a declaration that Bumpy Johnson had already won the moral argument. In that simple act of sharing food, Bumpy had demonstrated true power, the ability to confront authority calmly, expose its contradictions, and leave his challengers changed. And in that booth, over pie, Harrison understood how profoundly one moment could redefine belief, authority, and conscience. Years after the encounter at Morrison's diner, the meaning of that night continued to unfold in quiet, lasting ways. In 1979, journalist Sarah Chen sought to understand Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson beyond his reputation, and her search led her to retired Detective William Harrison, one of the officers present that evening. Living in Queens and long removed from active duty, Harrison finally spoke about the moment that reshaped his understanding of power, justice, and morality. Harrison confessed that he had entered the diner believing authority and fear defined power, only to realize through Bumpy's calm defiance and moral clarity and justice were not the same. Though no arrest was made, Harrison believed that arresting Bumpy would have been the greatest moral failure of his career. That realization followed him for the rest of his life, altering how he viewed the justice system and his role within it. He remained on the force for years afterward, changed and questioning, striving imperfectly to act with greater awareness and restraint. Other officers, like Detective Mosley, never questioned the system and rose through its ranks. Yet, even Mosley was privately haunted by Bumpy's certainty and insight. Harrison, however, carried the weight of that night openly until his death in 1995. His obituary was modest, but at his funeral, Sarah Chen honored him as a man who found the courage to doubt his own righteousness and live with that truth. The system itself did not change. Harlem's struggles persisted, the drug trade continued, and Bumpy Johnson eventually died as he lived entangled in the same cycle. Yet something intangible had shifted. Police authority lost some of its illusion, the community shed some of its shame, and certainty gave way to understanding. For one moment, a man surrounded by power revealed the deeper injustice beneath it, forcing his oppressors to listen. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's legacy was not defined by his crimes, but by that single moment when he transformed guilt into truth and exposed the system itself. In a diner booth, with quiet clarity, he showed that real power lies not in badges or force, but in the ability to change how others see the world. That memory endured, carried by a detective, a journalist, a community, and became the true legacy of Morrison's Diner and of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson.